It all started in 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US shocked the world by dropping powerful, calamitous atomic bombs. Since then, countries scrambled to get their hands on these nuclear bombs, the first being the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb in 1949, the world saw the US and the USSR as the most powerful nations on this planet. However, people fear that if a nuclear war broke out between these two nations, it could mean the start of World War III. And never has the world been as close to this than in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis started in October of 1962, when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev spotted US missiles in Turkey and Italy. Viewing this as a threat to their nation, he responded by secretly deciding to send ships and submarines carrying nukes to Cuba, with the permission of the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. It was only until a US biplane called U-2 flew over Cuba that the United States was aware of this threat to their nation. After capturing hundreds of images spotting Soviet nukes, tanks, and military equipment, the United States raised the national DEFCON, or emergency level, to 2, the highest it has ever been in history. For 13 days, the world watched nervously and prepared for the worst. However, the crisis finally ended when Kennedy secretly came to an agreement with Khrushchev that he would remove the missiles in Europe if missiles were removed from Cuba. Now you might be thinking, why Cuba? Well, at the time, Cuba was a communist nation, and they befriended the Soviet Union. Also, the close proximity to the United States provided a wide coverage for the Soviet Union. This also gave the small island, as well as communism, a chance at becoming more powerful. However, no one in Cuba had a clue about the crisis, except for Fidel Castro. In the United States, however, people had capitalist beliefs and were totally against Cuba and the Soviet Union's ideology of communism, which is why they feared that because of the contradicting ideologies, a war was inevitable. This brings up two unique perspectives: American students and Cuban civilians. People in Cuba were very confused when they saw the Soviet military invading their land. Soviets were disguised by wearing civilian clothing and were not allowed to speak Russian. Also, due to communist ideology, the social communication between the Cuban government and its citizens was extremely weak. In fact, a Cuban farmer living in Cuba at the time explains in a CNN interview, "Back then, we didn't have TV. We didn't get the news, no one delivered the paper, you lived to work." This goes to show that the lack of social communication between the government and its citizens shaped the way the Cubans viewed the crisis, as they felt insignificant and were infuriated once they got the news. However, in the United States, everyone was informed of the situation, as John F. Kennedy delivered a nationwide speech on October 22, 1962.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
This immediately flooded children with fear while they observed people stockpiling essentials and building fallout shelters. Schools in the US were forced to perform drills in which students would duck and cover under their desks. Students were now constantly under the impression that there was going to be an inevitable nuclear attack that would put their lives in danger. One person even recalls, "I didn't sleep for days." These students never grew up with war, unlike their parents. Therefore, this new looming danger changed the way they viewed their lives, which used to be relatively safe, with two giant oceans sealing them from the rest of the world. Over in Cuba, however, fear was the one thing that Cubans didn't have. In fact, according to Western Oregon University, one Cuban mentions that when the news reached us, we had felt that we had become some kind of bargaining chip. It also mentions that the crisis caused serious damage to Soviet-Cuban relations, which made them ditch the Soviets and turn to the Chinese instead. Filled with anger, Cubans took to the streets and started protesting, thinking war has already begun. On top of that, military troops were destroying people's property without consent, including farms and huts. This crisis left the Cubans both infuriated and powerless, as it shaped their political ideology dramatically, while political ideology in the US remained the same. In a nutshell, the Cuban Missile Crisis left American students flooded with fear and uncertainty, while civilians in Cuba were infuriated by the lack of communication, as the war made them feel insignificant and powerless. These two unique perspectives, which differ socially, politically, and culturally, help us understand the main effect of the crisis and how capitalists and communists react to tension in ways that would change their views on nuclear war. The results of the crisis not only prevented a possible World War III, but also taught us that war is not needed to solve problems. That being said, to what extent do you think the Cuban and American perspectives would have changed if the U-2 spy planes didn't investigate Cuba?